Sarah Martinez had always been smaller than everyone else. At 5'3" and barely weighing 120 pounds, she looked more like a college student than someone who belonged in the brutal world of Marine Corps training. When she first walked through the gates of Marine Corps Recruit Depot Paris Island, the other recruits couldn't help but stare. Some whispered behind her back, wondering how someone so tiny had even made it past the physical requirements. The drill instructors noticed her immediately. Sergeant Johnson, a mountain of a man with scars running down his left arm, looked her up and down with obvious doubt. He had been training Marines for 15 years and had seen plenty of recruits who looked tough but couldn't handle the pressure. Sarah, however, presented the opposite problem. She looked like a strong wind could knock her over. Yet here she was, standing in formation with the rest of them. During the first week of training, Sarah struggled with many of the physical challenges. The obstacle course seemed designed for people twice her size. When she tried to climb over the wooden barriers, she had to jump and pull herself up, while others simply stepped over them. The rope climb was even worse. Her small hands could barely grip the thick rope, and she watched in frustration as bigger recruits powered their way to the top while she struggled just to get halfway. The other recruits began to notice her difficulties. During break time, she overheard conversations about whether she would make it through training. Some of the men, and even a few of the women, made jokes about how she looked like she belonged in high school instead of the Marines. The comments stung, but Sarah had heard similar things her entire life. Growing up in a rough neighborhood in Detroit, she had always been underestimated because of her size. What her fellow recruits didn't know was that Sarah had been studying martial arts since she was 8 years old. Her father, a former Army soldier, had enrolled her in classes after she came home from school with a black eye from bullies. Over the years, she had mastered several different fighting styles. She earned her black belt in karate at 16, but didn't stop there. She learned judo, Brazilian jiu-jitsu, and even some street fighting techniques from her older brothers. Her martial arts training had taught her something that many people never learned. Size and strength weren't everything. Technique, speed, and the ability to use an opponent's power against them could overcome almost any physical disadvantage. She had proven this countless times in tournaments and sparring matches. But at Paris Island, she hadn't had the chance to show what she could really do. The Marines emphasized teamwork and unit cohesion, but there was also an unspoken hierarchy based on physical dominance. The biggest and strongest recruits naturally became informal leaders. Sarah found herself near the bottom of this hierarchy. Despite her determination and her perfect scores on written tests, she could memorize military procedures faster than anyone else in her platoon and never missed a detail during inspections. None of that seemed to matter when it came to earning respect. Corporal Williams, one of the assistant drill instructors, seemed particularly skeptical of Sarah's presence. During physical training sessions, he would often use her as an example of what not to do. When she couldn't complete a pull-up, he would make the entire platoon do extra exercises. When she fell behind during runs, he would shout that the Marines didn't have time to babysit people who couldn't keep up. The psychological pressure was intense. Every day brought new challenges designed to break down recruits and rebuild them as Marines. Sarah watched as several of her fellow recruits quit and went home. The training was harder than anything she had experienced, and there were moments when she wondered if everyone else was right about her not belonging there. But Sarah had a secret weapon that went beyond her martial arts training: an unbreakable mental toughness. Growing up in Detroit had taught her to never give up, no matter how bad things got. When her family lost their house during the economic recession, she had worked 2 jobs while finishing high school to help support her younger siblings. When her father was injured in a construction accident and couldn't work for 6 months, she had stepped up to help hold the family together. The other recruits saw her struggles during physical training, but they didn't see her staying up late every night. practicing knots and memorizing field manual procedures by flashlight under her blanket. They didn't see her doing extra push-ups and sit-ups in the bathroom when everyone else was sleeping. They didn't know that she ran an extra mile every morning before the official physical training began, determined to improve her endurance. As the weeks passed, Sarah began to improve in many areas. Her running times got better, and she could complete more push-ups and sit-ups than when she started. But the other recruits had improved too, and the gap between her and the top performers remained wide. The jokes and whispered comments continued. Some recruits started calling her Mouse because of her small size and quiet demeanor. The nickname spread throughout the platoon, and even some of the drill instructors began using it. Sarah pretended not to care, but inside, her determination grew stronger. She had faced doubt and ridicule her entire life, and she had always found a way to prove the doubters wrong. This time would be no different. During mess hall conversations, she listened as the bigger recruits talked about their plans for advanced training and their dreams of joining elite units like Force Recon or Marine Special Operations. They discussed combat scenarios and debated different fighting techniques, never thinking to include her in these conversations. To them, she was just trying to survive basic training, not someone who might actually excel in combat situations. Sarah knew that a real test was coming. Soon, they would begin hand-to-hand combat training, where recruits would learn basic fighting techniques and practice them against each other. This was where she could finally show what she was capable of. All those years of martial arts training, all those hours spent learning how to defeat bigger and stronger opponents, had been preparing her for moments like this. The irony wasn't lost on her. The same recruits who looked down on her because of her size would soon discover that in hand-to-hand combat, size could actually be a disadvantage. Bigger opponents moved more slowly and telegraphed their attacks. They relied on strength instead of technique, and they often became overconfident when facing smaller opponents. Sarah had been waiting patiently for her chance to change the way her fellow recruits saw her. She knew that respect in the Marines was earned through actions, not words. Soon, she would have the opportunity to show everyone exactly what this small woman from Detroit could do when given the chance to fight. The announcement came during morning formation on a humid Tuesday in June. Drill instructor Sergeant Johnson stood before the platoon with his usual stern expression, but there was something different in his voice today. The recruits had completed 8 weeks of basic training, and now they were moving into more advanced combat skills. Today would mark the beginning of hand-to-hand combat training, officially known as the Marine Corps Martial Arts Program. Sarah felt her heart rate increase as Sergeant Johnson explained the program. This was the moment she had been waiting for since arriving at Paris Island. While the other recruits shifted nervously, unsure of what to expect, Sarah remained perfectly still. She had spent years preparing for exactly this type of training, though none of her fellow Marines knew it. The training would take place in a large gymnasium with thick mats covering the floor. The recruits filed in, looking around at the intimidating space. Posted on the walls were diagrams showing various combat techniques, pressure points, and defensive positions. The smell of sweat and rubber mats filled the air, creating an atmosphere of serious physical training. Corporal Martinez, a compact man with lightning-fast reflexes, would be their primary instructor for martial arts training. He had served 2 tours in Afghanistan and had earned his black belt in the Marine Corps system. As he demonstrated the first techniques, his movements were precise and economical. Every motion had a purpose, and there was no wasted energy in his demonstrations. The first week focused on basic stances, footwork, and simple strikes. Sarah absorbed every detail, though she was careful not to show too much familiarity with the techniques. She didn't want to reveal her extensive background yet. Instead, she watched and learned, noting how the Marine system differed from the martial arts she had studied. The Marine approach was more direct and brutal, designed for battlefield situations rather than tournament competition. During partner drills, Sarah was usually paired with other smaller recruits, or sometimes with the women in the platoon. Her partners often went easy on her, assuming she needed protection from harder training. She played along with their assumptions, using these practice sessions to observe and analyze the fighting styles of different recruits. She was gathering intelligence, learning their tendencies and weaknesses. Rodriguez, a stocky recruit from Texas who had played football in high school, was particularly vocal about the combat training. He bragged about bar fights he had won back home and made jokes about how easy it would be to handle smaller opponents. During water breaks, he would demonstrate techniques on imaginary enemies, always choosing scenarios where size and strength were the determining factors. Thompson, a tall recruit from rural Montana who had grown up wrestling, dominated most of the grappling exercises. At 6'4" and weighing over 200 pounds, he could overpower almost anyone in the platoon through sheer physical force. He had a habit of using more strength than necessary during drills, leaving his partners bruised and intimidated. Jackson, another large recruit who had boxed in college, was technically skilled, but relied heavily on his reach advantage. He would keep opponents at a distance with his long arms, using jabs and straight punches to control the fighting distance. Like the others, he assumed that smaller opponents would be easy targets for his superior reach and power. As the weeks progressed, the training became more intense. They learned ground fighting techniques, defensive tactics, and how to escape from various holds and grabs. The drill instructors pushed them harder, creating more realistic combat scenarios. Recruits began to get injured during training, nothing serious, but enough bruises, twisted ankles, and sore muscles to remind everyone that this was serious business. Sarah continued to fly under the radar, performing adequately but never standing out. She made deliberate mistakes sometimes, asking for extra help with techniques she had mastered years ago. The instructors saw her as a dedicated recruit who was trying her best despite physical limitations. Her fellow recruits saw her as someone who was struggling but not giving up. What none of them realized was that Sarah was studying them as much as she was studying the techniques. During every drill, every sparring session, and every demonstration, she was analyzing the fighting patterns of the larger recruits. She noticed that Rodriguez always threw the same combination of punches when he got excited. Thompson had a habit of dropping his left hand after throwing a right cross. Jackson telegraphed his takedown attempts by shifting his weight in an obvious pattern. The psychological warfare continued outside of combat training. During meals, the bigger recruits would discuss their plans for the upcoming practical tests. They talked about which techniques worked best for their body types and shared stories about fights they had won in civilian life. Sarah listened to everything, filing away information that might be useful later. Sergeant Johnson had been watching all of his recruits carefully during combat training. As an experienced drill instructor, he had developed an instinct for identifying recruits who were hiding their true capabilities. Something about Sarah's movements caught his attention. Her footwork was too clean for someone who was supposedly learning these techniques for the first time. Her defensive reactions were too quick and too precise. During one afternoon training session, Sergeant Johnson decided to test his suspicions. He asked Sarah to demonstrate a defensive technique against a larger opponent, pairing her with Rodriguez. As Rodriguez threw a slow, predictable punch for the demonstration, Sarah's response was perfect. Too perfect. She slipped the punch with minimal movement. Her counter-positioning was textbook, and her balance never wavered. After the class, Sergeant Johnson pulled Sarah aside. He didn't ask direct questions about her background, but his knowing look suggested he suspected there was more to her story. Sarah maintained her innocent expression, thanking him for the extra attention and promising to work harder on her techniques. But both of them knew something unspoken had passed between them. The formal evaluation was approaching fast. In 2 weeks, all recruits would be tested on their combat skills in front of the entire training staff. The test would include demonstrations of basic techniques, But more importantly, it would include live sparring matches against other recruits. These matches would be serious affairs, with winners and losers clearly identified. Sarah began to prepare mentally for what was coming. She had spent weeks observing, learning, and planning. She knew exactly which opponents she was likely to face and had identified their weaknesses. More importantly, she had been holding back long enough that everyone underestimated what she could do. The other recruits were nervous about the upcoming evaluation, but they were most worried about facing each other. The biggest and strongest recruits expected to dominate, while the smaller ones hoped to simply avoid embarrassment. None of them were thinking about Sarah as a serious threat. In their minds, she was just trying to survive the test, not win it. Sarah knew that everything was about to change. Soon, the mouse would show her claws, and the entire platoon would learn that they had been completely wrong about who the most dangerous recruit really was. The day of the combat evaluation arrived with typical Marine Corps precision. The gymnasium had been transformed into an arena, with the training staff seated at tables along one wall and the recruits arranged in formation along the others. The atmosphere was electric with nervous energy, as each recruit knew their performance would be closely scrutinized and would affect their standing in the platoon. Sergeant Johnson stood at the center of the mats, holding a clipboard with the testing schedule. He explained the format. First, individual technique demonstrations, then sparring matches between randomly selected pairs. The sparring would be full contact, but controlled, with instructors ready to stop any match that got too dangerous. Points would be awarded for clean technique, aggression, and tactical awareness. Sarah sat quietly in the formation, her expression calm and focused. Around her, the bigger recruits were trying to pump themselves up, shadowboxing and stretching dramatically. Rodriguez was talking loudly about how he planned to end his matches quickly. Thompson was cracking his knuckles and rolling his massive shoulders. Jackson bounced on his toes, throwing practice combinations into the air. The individual demonstrations went smoothly for most recruits. Each one was called forward to show specific techniques against a training partner. Sarah's turn came in the middle of the group. She performed the required moves competently, but without flair, earning nods of approval from the instructors, but no special attention. To everyone watching, she looked like a recruit who had learned the basics, but wasn't particularly gifted at combat. Then came the moment everyone had been waiting for: the sparring matches. Sergeant Johnson began calling names randomly, creating pairs that would fight 3-minute rounds. The first few matches were predictable. Bigger recruits dominated smaller ones through superior reach and strength. The technique was often sloppy, but raw power carried the day in most cases. Rodriguez faced a medium-sized recruit named Peterson and overwhelmed him with aggressive rushing attacks. Thompson grappled with another large recruit and used his wrestling background to control the match on the ground. Jackson boxed with a recruit from his size category and used his superior technique to win a clear decision. With each victory by the larger recruits, their confidence grew. Sarah watched every match intently, studying not just the winners, but how they won. She noted Rodriguez's tendency to drop his guard when he pressed forward aggressively. She observed Thompson's habit of committing too much weight when going for takedowns. She saw how Jackson became predictable when he was winning, repeating the same successful combinations. Finally, Sergeant Johnson called her name. "Martinez, you're up next." The gymnasium fell quiet as everyone turned to look at the small recruit rising from her position in formation. Then came the announcement that changed everything. "Rodriguez, you're her opponent." A ripple of laughter went through the assembled recruits. Rodriguez grinned widely and bumped fists with the recruits sitting near him. At 190 pounds of solid muscle, he outweighed Sarah by 70 pounds. He had just dominated his previous opponent and was riding high on confidence. To him, this wasn't going to be a fight. It was going to be a demonstration of why size mattered in combat. As the two fighters moved to the center of the mat, the contrast was stark. Rodriguez looked like a predator stalking his prey, while Sarah appeared calm but small. The other recruits began making quiet bets on how quickly the match would end. Most gave Sarah less than a minute before Rodriguez would overwhelm her. Corporal Martinez, serving as the referee, brought the fighters together for final instructions. "This is controlled sparring. Follow my commands at all times. Touch gloves and return to your corners." Rodriguez tapped Sarah's gloves dismissively, already looking past her toward his next opponent. Sarah met his eyes briefly, and for just a moment, Rodriguez saw something that made him slightly uncomfortable, but the feeling passed quickly. The whistle blew, and Rodriguez immediately rushed forward, just as Sarah had predicted. He threw a wild overhand right, putting all of his weight behind it, expecting to end the fight with one punch. But Sarah wasn't there anymore. She had slipped to her left with perfect timing, and Rodriguez's massive punch hit nothing but air. Off balance from his missed swing, Rodriguez stumbled forward slightly. In that instant of vulnerability, Sarah struck. Her right hand shot up in a precise uppercut that caught Rodriguez directly under the chin. The punch wasn't thrown with devastating power, but it was timed perfectly and landed on exactly the right spot. Rodriguez's head snapped back, and his legs wobbled. Before he could recover, Sarah followed up with a lightning-fast combination. A left hook to his liver made him bend forward slightly, and then her right knee came up to meet his descending face. The impact echoed through the gymnasium like a gunshot. Rodriguez's eyes rolled back, and he collapsed to the mat like a fallen tree. The silence in the gymnasium was deafening. For several seconds, nobody moved or spoke. Rodriguez lay motionless on the mat, while Sarah stood over him, her hands still raised in a fighting position, breathing steadily and showing no signs of exhaustion. Corporal Martinez rushed to check on Rodriguez, who was conscious but completely dazed. Slowly, the reality of what had just happened began to sink in among the recruits. The smallest, weakest member of their platoon had just knocked out one of the biggest, strongest fighters with a combination that lasted less than 10 seconds. The recruit they had nicknamed Mouse had just revealed herself to be a completely different kind of animal. Sergeant Johnson stood up from his chair, his expression unreadable. He had suspected that Sarah was more capable than she appeared, but even he hadn't expected anything like this. As a drill instructor with years of experience, he had seen plenty of surprising moments, but this was something special. Rodriguez was helped to his feet, still shaky and confused. He looked at Sarah with a mixture of shock and something that might have been fear. The confident fighter who had entered the match was gone, replaced by someone who had just learned a hard lesson about underestimating opponents. The other large recruits who had been joking and laughing just minutes earlier were now completely silent. Thompson's cocky grin had vanished. Jackson stopped shadowboxing. The entire dynamic of the platoon had shifted in those 10 seconds. Sarah walked back to her corner, her expression unchanged. She wasn't gloating or celebrating. She had simply done what needed to be done, the same way she had been doing everything else since arriving at Paris Island. But now, everyone was looking at her differently. Sergeant Johnson stepped forward to address the group. "That, recruits, is why we train techniques instead of just lifting weights. Size and strength mean nothing if you can't use them effectively." He looked directly at Sarah. "Outstanding work, Martinez. Return to formation." As Sarah took her seat, whispers began among the other recruits. The word mouse was replaced by nervous discussions about where she had learned to fight like that. The recruits who had been dismissing her as weak were now trying to remember if they had ever said anything insulting within her hearing. But Sarah's demonstration was far from over. Sergeant Johnson looked at his clipboard and made another announcement that sent shockwaves through the room. "Martinez, you've got 4 more matches today. Thompson, you're up next." The real test was just beginning, And everyone in that gymnasium was about to learn just how wrong they had been about the quiet recruit from Detroit. Thompson walked to the center of the mat with far less confidence than Rodriguez had shown just minutes earlier. At 6'4", he towered over Sarah. But Rodriguez's unconscious form being helped to the sidelines served as a stark reminder that size wasn't everything. Still, Thompson had advantages that Rodriguez hadn't possessed. His wrestling background meant he understood leverage and technique, not just brute strength. As they touched gloves, Thompson tried to intimidate Sarah with his stare, but her eyes remained calm and focused. She had studied his wrestling style during weeks of training and knew exactly what he would try to do. Wrestling was about controlling distance and getting the fight to the ground, where his size and strength would matter most. Sarah had no intention of letting that happen. The whistle blew, and Thompson immediately began circling, his hands extended in front of him, looking for an opportunity to grab Sarah and take her down. This was a smart tactic. He had learned from Rodriguez's mistake of rushing in wildly, but Sarah had expected this approach and was ready for it. Thompson shot forward for a double-leg takedown, a wrestling move he had used successfully hundreds of times. His technique was textbook perfect. Low-level change, head to the side, driving through with his legs. Against most opponents, especially smaller ones, this move would have been unstoppable. But Sarah wasn't most opponents. As Thompson dove low, Sarah's training in Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu kicked in. She sprawled backward, shooting her legs back and dropping her hips low to avoid his grasping arms. At the same time, she brought her forearm down hard across the back of Thompson's exposed neck, a move called a sprawl and brawl that was designed specifically to counter wrestling takedowns. Thompson found himself face down on the mat, with Sarah's full weight pressing down on his back. Before he could scramble back to his feet, Sarah had wrapped her arms around his neck in a rear naked choke. Her technique was flawless. One arm across his throat, the other hand gripping her own bicep, his airway completely cut off. Thompson panicked. His wrestling training had taught him how to escape from many positions, but this choke was locked in perfectly. He tried to stand up, but Sarah stayed glued to his back like a backpack. He tried to roll, but she rolled with him, maintaining the chokehold. Within 15 seconds, his face was turning red as his air supply was cut off. Corporal Martinez watched carefully, ready to stop the match if necessary. Thompson's struggles became more desperate, and then suddenly weaker. His hands, which had been clawing at Sarah's arms, began to drop. Sarah felt his body going limp and immediately released the choke, pushing away from him as Corporal Martinez stepped in. Thompson gasped for air, rolling onto his back and staring at the ceiling in complete bewilderment. He had been choked unconscious in less than 30 seconds by someone who weighed barely more than half what he did. His wrestling credentials, his size advantage, his years of training, none of it had mattered. The gymnasium was absolutely silent, except for Thompson's heavy breathing. The recruits were no longer just surprised. They were shocked into speechless amazement. Two of the platoon's most dominant fighters had been defeated in less than a minute of combined fighting time, and Sarah looked like she was just getting warmed up. Sergeant Johnson called the next name, Jackson Centermat. The tall boxer, who had been so confident earlier, now approached with visible reluctance. He had watched Sarah dismantle two different fighting styles with completely different techniques. Rodriguez's striking had been countered with superior striking. Thompson's wrestling had been defeated with superior grappling. Jackson was beginning to realize that he might be facing someone who was better than all of them at everything. Jackson tried to use his boxing skills more carefully than Rodriguez had. He maintained proper distance, kept his hands up, and threw controlled jabs to test Sarah's reactions. His technique was actually quite good. He had learned to box properly, not just brawl, but Sarah had been studying his style for weeks and knew exactly what he was going to do. Jackson threw a quick 1-2 combination, jab, followed by a cross. Sarah slipped both punches with minimal movement, then stepped inside his guard before he could retreat. At close range, his height and reach advantages disappeared, and Sarah's speed became the dominant factor. She attacked his legs with a vicious low kick that swept his front foot out from under him. As Jackson stumbled, trying to regain his balance, Sarah grabbed his extended arm and used a judo throw called an ippon seoi nage. She ducked under his arm, placed her shoulder against his chest, and used his own momentum to flip him over her back. Jackson crashed to the mat hard, landing flat on his back with Sarah controlling his arm. Before he could escape, she had transitioned into an armbar, extending his elbow joint beyond its natural range. Jackson immediately tapped out, knowing that his arm would be broken if he didn't surrender. 3 down. The pattern was becoming clear to everyone watching. Sarah wasn't just lucky or having a good day. She was systematically dismantling every opponent using whatever technique was most effective against their particular style. She was like a master chess player, always 3 moves ahead of her opponents. The 4th opponent was Carter, a Marine who prided himself on being well-rounded. He had some boxing, some wrestling, and some basic martial arts training. He thought his diverse skills would make him harder to defeat than the specialists who had come before him. He was wrong. Carter tried to keep the fight standing, but avoid getting too close, looking for opportunities to strike while staying away from Sarah's grappling. It was a sound strategy in theory, but Sarah's superior footwork allowed her to control the distance. She cut off his angles, herded him toward the edges of the mat, and forced him to fight where she wanted to fight. When Carter threw a kick, Sarah caught his leg and immediately swept his standing leg, sending him crashing to the mat. She followed him down and secured a triangle choke, wrapping her legs around his neck and one arm while pulling down on his head. Carter struggled briefly, but quickly realized he was caught and tapped out. 4 opponents defeated in under 3 minutes of total fighting time. The recruits were no longer whispering among themselves. They were sitting in stunned silence, trying to process what they were witnessing. Some of them were beginning to feel afraid. If Sarah could do this to the best fighters in the platoon, what could she do to them? Sergeant Johnson looked at his clipboard and called the final name. Williams, center mat. Williams was the largest recruit in the platoon, standing 6'6" and weighing well over 220 pounds. He had been quiet during the previous matches, watching and learning from the mistakes of others. Unlike the previous opponents, Williams didn't look overconfident. He looked genuinely concerned. As the 2 fighters approached the center of the mat, the size difference was more dramatic than ever. Williams looked like he could pick Sarah up and throw her across the room, but everyone in that gymnasium had learned not to judge this fight by appearances. Williams had been studying Sarah's techniques during the previous matches. He had noticed that she used her opponent's aggression and momentum against them. So, he decided to try a different approach. He would stay defensive, make her come to him, and try to use his size to simply overwhelm her when she got close. It was actually a smart strategy. But Sarah had one more technique in her arsenal that none of her previous opponents had forced her to use. As Williams stood in a defensive posture, waiting for her to attack, Sarah did something that surprised everyone in the gymnasium, including Sergeant Johnson. She smiled. For the first time since the matches began, Sarah showed emotion. It wasn't a friendly smile or a nervous smile. It was the smile of a predator who had been playing with her food and was now ready to finish the meal. Williams saw that smile and felt a chill run down his spine. The final match was about to begin, and everyone in that room knew they were about to witness something extraordinary. Williams stood in the center of the mat like a mountain, his defensive stance solid and intimidating. At 220 pounds of muscle, he represented the biggest physical challenge Sarah had faced yet. But that smile on her face told everyone watching that she wasn't intimidated. If anything, she looked like she had been waiting for this moment. The whistle blew, and neither fighter moved immediately. Williams maintained his defensive position, determined not to make the same mistakes as the others. Sarah circled him slowly, studying his stance and looking for openings. The tension in the gymnasium was thick enough to cut with a knife. Then Sarah did something completely unexpected. Instead of trying to close the distance or work around his defenses, she began to bounce lightly on her toes and started talking. Not loudly enough for the spectators to hear clearly, but Williams could hear every word. "You're scared," she said quietly, her voice calm and conversational. "You watched me drop 4 Marines in 3 minutes, and now you're standing there hoping I'll make a mistake." Williams tried to ignore her, but Sarah continued, "Your hands are shaking. Look at them." Williams glanced down at his hands and realized she was right. A slight tremor was visible in his fingers. He was more nervous than he wanted to admit, and somehow she had noticed. Sarah pressed her psychological advantage. "You're bigger than me, stronger than me, and you still know you're going to lose," she continued, still circling. "Want to know how I know?" Williams said nothing, but his jaw was clenched tight. "Because you're fighting my fight now. You're thinking about what I'm going to do instead of what you're going to do." She was absolutely right, and Williams realized it with growing horror. He had been so focused on avoiding Sarah's techniques that he had forgotten to implement his own game plan. He was reacting instead of acting, defensive instead of aggressive. In his mind, he had already lost the fight before it had really begun. Sarah suddenly stopped circling and faced Williams directly. "You know what your problem is?" she asked, and then answered before he could respond. "You think this is about size?" Without warning, she stepped forward and slapped him lightly across the face. Not hard enough to hurt, but enough to sting his pride. The slap did exactly what Sarah intended. Williams's careful defensive strategy evaporated in a flash of anger and humiliation. A 120-pound woman had just slapped him in front of his entire platoon, and his male ego couldn't tolerate it. He abandoned his plan and rushed forward with a wild swing, just like Rodriguez had done. But Sarah had evolved her strategy since the first match. Instead of simply slipping the punch, she stepped directly into Williams' attack, getting inside his reach before his massive fist could build momentum. At close range, his size became a disadvantage. He couldn't generate power, and his reach meant nothing. Sarah drove an elbow strike directly into Williams' solar plexus, the cluster of nerves just below the rib cage. The blow wasn't particularly hard, but it hit the exact right spot with perfect timing. Williams doubled over, gasping for air, completely vulnerable. What happened next would be talked about in Marine Corps training circles for years to come. As Williams bent forward, Sarah grabbed the back of his head with both hands and pulled down while driving her knee upward. But instead of aiming for his face, she targeted a pressure point at the base of his skull, where the neck meets the head. The impact sent a shock through Williams' nervous system. His legs buckled immediately, and he collapsed to his knees, completely stunned. Sarah didn't follow up with more strikes. She didn't need to. Williams was conscious but completely helpless, unable to defend himself or continue fighting. Corporal Martinez stepped in and called the match. Williams knelt on the mat, shaking his head and trying to clear the fog from his brain. Sarah stepped back, her expression returning to the same calm focus she had shown before the fighting began. No celebration, no gloating, just professional competence. The gymnasium erupted in chaos. Recruits were on their feet, shouting and pointing. Some were cheering, some were cursing, and some were just staring in disbelief. In less than 5 minutes, Sarah Martinez had defeated 5 of the biggest, strongest, most skilled fighters in the entire platoon. She had used 5 completely different techniques, adapted to 5 different fighting styles, and made it look easy. Sergeant Johnson stood up and shouted for quiet. As the noise died down, he walked to the center of the mat where Sarah stood waiting. His expression was unreadable, but there was something like respect in his eyes. "Recruits," he announced, his voice carrying easily through the silent gymnasium. "What you just witnessed is the difference between a fighter and a warrior. Size, strength, and even skill mean nothing without the mental toughness to use them effectively." He gestured towards Sarah. "Martinez just gave you all a masterclass in combat psychology, tactical thinking, and technical execution." He turned to address Sarah directly. "Where did you learn to fight like that, recruit?" Sarah's response was simple and direct. "Detroit, sir. You learn to survive, or you don't survive." She didn't elaborate, didn't mention her years of martial arts training, or her family background. In her mind, those details weren't relevant. What mattered was results. Sergeant Johnson nodded slowly. He had suspected there was more to Sarah's story, and now he knew he was right. But he also knew that every Marine had a story, and what mattered was not where they came from, but what they could do when it counted. "Outstanding performance, Martinez," he said officially. Then, in a quieter voice that only she could hear, he added, "Next time, don't wait so long to show us what you can do." As Sarah returned to formation, the entire dynamic of the platoon had shifted permanently. The recruits who had been calling her Mouse were now looking at her with a mixture of respect and fear. The jokes had stopped completely, replaced by whispered conversations about where she had learned those techniques and whether anyone else in the platoon had been hiding similar skills. Rodriguez, still nursing his bruised jaw, avoided making eye contact with her. Thompson rubbed his throat unconsciously every time he looked in her direction. Jackson flexed his arm carefully, remembering how close he had come to having it broken. Williams sat quietly, still trying to process what had happened to him. Carter just stared, shaking his head in disbelief. The training staff was equally impressed. Corporal Martinez, who had been teaching combat skills for 3 years, had never seen such a comprehensive display of martial arts knowledge from a recruit. The techniques Sarah had used weren't just effective. They were perfectly chosen for each specific opponent and situation. That level of tactical thinking suggested training and experience far beyond what most recruits possessed. As the evaluation continued with matches between other recruits, Sarah sat quietly and watched. The fighting skills of her fellow Marines seemed almost amateurish now compared to what she had just demonstrated. Sloppy technique, poor distance management, and predictable strategies dominated the remaining matches. It became clear that Sarah was operating on a completely different level from everyone else. During the break between sessions, several recruits approached Sarah with questions. They wanted to know how she had learned to fight, whether she could teach them some techniques, and how long she had been training. Sarah answered politely but briefly, not revealing much about her background. She had learned to be cautious about sharing too much information too quickly, but the most significant change was in how the drill instructors treated her. During the remaining weeks of training, Sarah found herself being given additional responsibilities and more challenging assignments. Sergeant Johnson began asking for her opinions during tactical discussions. Corporal Martinez invited her to help demonstrate advanced techniques to other recruits. The physical training that had once been her weakness became much more manageable as her confidence grew. Her running times improved dramatically when she wasn't holding back. Her performance on the obstacle course got better when she stopped trying to hide her athletic ability. It turned out that much of her earlier struggles had been mental rather than physical. Word of Sarah's performance spread beyond her immediate platoon. Other drill instructors came to watch her during training exercises, curious to see the recruit who had dropped 5 Marines in a single session. Some of them had heard exaggerated versions of the story and wanted to see if she was really as good as the rumors suggested. The other female recruits in the training company were particularly inspired by Sarah's success. For weeks, they had watched her struggle with some of the physical challenges and had worried that the men in their platoon would use her difficulties as evidence that women didn't belong in combat roles. Now, those same men were treating Sarah with the kind of respect usually reserved for proven warriors. Sarah's transformation from overlooked recruit to platoon standout was complete, but she handled the attention with the same quiet professionalism she had shown throughout training. She didn't let the respect go to her head, didn't become arrogant or boastful about her abilities. If anything, she became more focused on helping her fellow recruits improve their own skills. The incident in the gymnasium became legendary within the training company. New recruits arriving at Paris Island would hear the story of the small Marine who had defeated 5 larger opponents in minutes. The details grew more dramatic with each telling, but the core message remained the same. Never judge a Marine by their size or appearance. Years later, when Sarah had become a decorated combat veteran with multiple deployments, she would look back on that day as the moment when she truly became a Marine. Not because of the techniques she had displayed or the opponents she had defeated, but because of the respect she had earned through actions rather than words. The 5 Marines she had defeated that day would also remember the lesson they learned. Rodriguez eventually became a military police officer and would often tell new recruits about the importance of technique over strength. Thompson joined a reconnaissance unit, where his wrestling skills, properly applied, made him an excellent close-quarters combat specialist. Jackson became a martial arts instructor himself, teaching other Marines the boxing techniques that Sarah had helped him refine. Williams and Carter both went on to successful military careers, carrying with them a healthy respect for opponents who might be more skilled than they appeared. But for Sarah, the gymnasium that day had been more than just a demonstration of fighting skills. It had been the moment when she stopped hiding who she really was and started becoming the Marine she was meant to be. The final weeks of training at Paris Island passed with Sarah firmly established as one of the most respected recruits in the company. The dramatic shift in how others treated her was remarkable. But what impressed the training staff most was how she handled her newfound status. Instead of becoming arrogant or distant, Sarah used her influence to help struggling recruits improve their own performance. During evening study sessions, she would quietly assist other recruits with combat techniques, breaking down complex moves into simple steps they could understand. Her teaching style was patient and methodical, reflecting the years of training that had shaped her own skills. She never made anyone feel stupid for not understanding something immediately, remembering how it felt to be underestimated and dismissed. The 5 Marines she had defeated became some of her closest allies in the platoon. Rodriguez, once he got over his injured pride, sought her out for advice on improving his striking technique. Thompson asked her to help him develop better submission defense for his wrestling. Jackson wanted to learn how to fight more effectively at close range, where his height advantage disappeared. Williams and Carter formed an unlikely friendship with Sarah, bonding over their shared experience of being completely outclassed by someone they had underestimated. Williams, in particular, became fascinated by the psychology of combat that Sarah had demonstrated. He wanted to understand how she had gotten inside his head so effectively and turned his own strength against him. Sergeant Johnson watched these developments with satisfaction. He had seen many recruits with impressive physical abilities who never learned to be team players. Sarah's willingness to share her knowledge and help others improve showed the kind of leadership qualities that made for outstanding Marines. Her technical skills had gotten everyone's attention, but her character was what earned their lasting respect. The graduation ceremony approached quickly. Sarah's transformation from struggling recruit to platoon leader was complete, but she remained focused on the future rather than dwelling on past achievements. She had received orders to attend the School of Infantry at Camp Pendleton, where she would train for a combat military occupational specialty. During the final week, Corporal Martinez pulled Sarah aside for a private conversation. He had been in contact with instructors at various advanced training schools, and word of her abilities had already spread through the Marine Corps training community. Several elite units were interested in recruiting her once she completed her initial training. "You've got options, Martinez," he told her. Your combat skills are extraordinary, and your leadership potential is obvious, but you need to decide what kind of Marine you want to be. He handed her information packets about different career paths: reconnaissance, special operations, close protection, and martial arts instruction. Sarah studied the materials carefully, but her mind was already made up. She wanted to be where the action was, where her skills would be tested in real combat situations, rather than just training exercises. The reconnaissance community appealed to her because it combined individual excellence with small team operations. On graduation day, Sarah stood in formation with the rest of her platoon, wearing the same uniform as everyone else, but carrying herself with quiet confidence that set her apart. Her family had traveled from Detroit to watch the ceremony, and they barely recognized the composed, disciplined Marine who had replaced the uncertain young woman who had left home months earlier. Her father, the former Army soldier who had first enrolled her in martial arts classes, watched with tears in his eyes as his daughter received recognition as the top graduate in her platoon. He had always known she was special, but seeing her transformation into a Marine leader filled him with pride beyond anything he had ever experienced. After the ceremony, Sergeant Johnson approached Sarah's family to introduce himself. He spoke with them about her exceptional performance and her potential for advancement in the Marine Corps. But what he remembered most about that conversation was what Sarah's mother told him. She was always different. Even as a little girl, she never backed down from anything, no matter how big or scary it seemed. But she was also the first one to help someone who was hurt or in trouble. We knew she would do something special with her life. The story of Sarah's performance in the gymnasium had become part of Parris Island folklore by the time she graduated. New drill instructors would use it as an example when teaching recruits about the importance of mental toughness and proper technique. The training staff had even created a formal case study of the incident for use in leadership courses. But Sarah herself was already focused on the challenges ahead. At the School of Infantry, she would face new tests and meet new people who didn't know her reputation. She would have to prove herself all over again, this time in field exercises and tactical situations that more closely resembled actual combat. Her first day at Camp Pendleton began much like her first day at Parris Island, with curious stares and whispered comments about her small size. Some of the Marines in her new training company had heard rumors about a female recruit who had made waves at Parris Island, but they didn't immediately connect those stories with the quiet woman who had joined their ranks. Sarah smiled to herself as she listened to the familiar comments and assumptions. She had been here before, and she knew exactly how this story would end. The Marines around her would learn the same lesson that Rodriguez, Thompson, Jackson, Williams, and Carter had learned in that gymnasium months earlier. Size didn't matter. Appearance could be deceiving, and the most dangerous opponents were often the ones you least expected. During the first week of infantry training, Sarah kept a low profile, just as she had at Parris Island. She performed competently, but didn't stand out, allowing her new classmates to form the same incorrect assumptions about her capabilities. She watched and listened, learning about their backgrounds, their strengths, and their weaknesses. The training at Camp Pendleton was more advanced and more realistic than what she had experienced during basic training. They learned urban warfare tactics, practiced with live ammunition, and conducted field exercises that lasted for days. Sarah excelled in all areas, but she was especially impressive during close-quarters combat training. When the inevitable moment came for her to demonstrate her true abilities, the reaction was just as dramatic as it had been at Parris Island. Marines who had been dismissing her as a weak link suddenly found themselves on the receiving end of techniques they didn't even know existed. Word spread quickly through the training company, and then through the entire base. Sarah Martinez, the small Marine from Detroit, was building a reputation that would follow her throughout her career. She would go on to serve with distinction in multiple combat deployments, earn decorations for valor under fire, and eventually become an instructor herself, teaching new generations of Marines the lessons she had learned about courage, technique, and the importance of never underestimating an opponent. But it all started in that gymnasium at Paris Island, on the day when they laughed at her in drills, until she dropped 5 Marines in a single devastating demonstration that changed everything. The mouse had shown her claws, and the Marine Corps would never be the same. In the heart of Marine Corps training, Sarah Martinez's story unfolds as a powerful testament to the resilience of the human spirit. Standing at just 5'3" and weighing barely 120 pounds, Sarah entered the grueling world of Paris Island, looking more like a college student than a warrior. Whispers and jokes followed her. Fellow recruits dubbed her Mouse, doubting her place among the giants. She struggled visibly with obstacle courses and rope climbs, her small frame seemingly no match for the demands. Yet, beneath that unassuming exterior burned an unbreakable fire, forged in the tough streets of Detroit and honed through years of martial arts mastery. Judo, karate, Brazilian jiu-jitsu, these weren't just skills. They were her armor against a lifetime of underestimation. As training intensified, Sarah bided her time, observing her peers' strengths and weaknesses while enduring ridicule. Then came the hand-to-hand combat evaluation, a pivotal moment where she faced 5 towering opponents in rapid succession. With precision, speed, and unyielding mental toughness, she dismantled them one by one. Uppercuts, chokes, throws, and psychological tactics, turning their size against them. The gymnasium fell silent, then erupted in awe. What began as laughter ended in profound respect, proving that true strength isn't measured in muscles or height, but in technique, determination, and the courage to rise above doubt. This tale isn't just about combat. It's a life lesson we all need. How often have we been judged by appearances, dismissed as too small, too weak, or too ordinary? Sarah reminds us that our greatest battles are won from within. When life knocks you down, when voices whisper you don't belong, channel that inner warrior. Prove them wrong not with anger, but with quiet excellence. It's emotional because it mirrors our own struggles, the sting of being overlooked, the triumph of self-belief. Let Sarah's journey inspire you to embrace your hidden strengths and never let external judgments dim your light. If this story touched your heart or reminded you of your own victories over doubt, drop a comment below. Share your experiences of being underestimated and how you overcame it. We'd love to hear from you. And if you want more uplifting, real-life tales that ignite your spirit, hit that subscribe button, like this video, and turn on notifications so you never miss out. Together, let's celebrate the underdogs who change the world.